Welcome to episode 99 of the Actual Astronomy Podcast. This will be a gear talk episode. Maybe Gearworks would be a good title for this one. Anyway, I'm Chris, and joining me is Shane. We are amateur astronomers who love looking up at the night sky, and this podcast is for everyone who likes going out under the stars. Shane, you wanted to talk about diagonals, so I have to ask, what's your angle?
Right angle? Is it the right angle you're looking for?
Sure.
Well, so we've talked about in length, we've talked about just about every aspect of the light path in a telescope, other than diagonals. We've kind of briefly touched on them a little bit, but we really haven't spent much time talking about the differences because there actually are some variances in the diagonal world. So I thought, let's talk about it.
All right.
It might be helpful to some of our listeners, and we can talk about our opinions and whatever else.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's start here. I'm going to get you to define a couple things to start off with. All right. So two-part question. What is a diagonal, and what types of telescopes use diagonals? Because they're not used with every telescope.
Yeah. So a diagonal makes observing a little more comfortable for like refractors and then compound telescopes like Cassegrains and Maksudovs. And the diagonal is it's between the eyepiece and the telescope. So the diagonal connects to the telescope, and then it comes usually in most of the time, a 90-degree angle. So a right angle, which makes observing much more comfortable. And then you connect your eyepiece into the diagonal. So that's kind of the quick definition of what a diagonal is and which telescopes you use it with. So like Newtonians or Dob owners, they don't need a diagonal. They just have a focuser on the telescope, and basically the secondary mirror in that telescope is at a 90-degree angle, and sort of, I guess, makes the need of a diagonal irrelevant.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess specifically, I think they refer to what we call a diagonal is technically a star diagonal. Just kind of thinking on this, but we without exception, we would never call it a star diagonal. And then the reflecting telescopes and other telescopes will use, they'll call it just a diagonal as well, a diagonal mirror, but typically they'll just specify that that's just the mirror. So yeah, like you were saying, inside the Newtonian tube, there is a mirror, but it's inside the tube. It's sort of part and parcel with the telescope, not something you can as easily change out, although some people do, for different sizes or purposes. Or whatever, and that mirror in the Newtonian is mounted at 45 degrees, and as such, it brings the light cone out at 90 degrees. Whereas the 90-degree star diagonals that we have mirrors in there mounted at 45 degrees. So, sort of get into the nitty gritty of it, the mirror itself is at 45-degree angles, but it bounces the light, so it brings it out at a 90-degree angle from the focus end of the refractor or the Cassegrain or the Maksudov.
Yeah, good point about the mirror angle. I guess that the way I described it was a little misleading.
Yes, misleading our listeners again.
Yeah, don't trust Shane. That's the moral of the story in this podcast.
Yeah, no, it's not misleading at all. Not misleading at all. But we do have two types of mirror diagonals we use in our refractors or Schmidt Cassegrains, and oftentimes, and you see this sometimes almost too often, and that's 45-degree angled star diagonals.
Yeah, so there's the 90 degrees, which, like you said, is more common for the amateur astronomer, but a number of telescopes that you'll buy, particularly in department stores, may come with a 45-degree angle diagonal, and those are useful, but those are more commonly used for terrestrial viewing and not astronomical viewing. And it's just a matter of kind of where it puts you as the observer. If your telescope is parallel to the earth, the ground that you're standing on, and you're looking at trees or birds or whatever else, 45 degrees places you as the observer at a very comfortable angle, especially if you're sitting in a chair. But if you were to now point that telescope upwards and look at the stars with a 45-degree angle diagonal, you're going to have to sit on the ground. Like, it's going to place you as the observer very, very low. But changing that angle on the diagonal to 90 degrees makes it much more comfortable to observe with for nighttime observing.
Yeah, I had a 45-degree that I used for about a year or so, and when I bought my first 80mm f5 Acrobat, I was living in a small apartment, and I had a 8-inch Dob back home that I did use for most of my observing, but then, of course, I started going to the astronomy club site and didn't have my 8-inch around, so I just was using this little telescope, and very quickly the 45-degree angle diagonal wore pretty thin on me, so I splurged and bought a decent quality 90-degree 1 1/4 for it, and that just is such a better experience, really, for nighttime observing. But typically these come in two sizes, 1.25 inch and 2 inch. And so what's the difference in those sizes? I guess it kind of depends on the size of the focuser the telescope has.
Yeah, exactly. It's really just a matter of matching all of your components. If your telescope can accept a 2-inch diagonal and you have 2-inch eyepieces, then that is definitely the way to go. A 2-inch diagonal is fairly versatile as well, because you can get an adapter that just sits inside of the diagonal that allows it to accept 1 1/4 eyepieces. So then you can go between both barrel sizes. But there is a pretty substantial difference in size and weight between an 1 1/4 diagonal and a 2-inch. The 2-inch is the measurement. 1 1/4 to 2 inches isn't large on a ruler. But holy smokes, the actual like physical size of a 2-inch diagonal, the first time you see it is probably, at least for me, it was kind of like, holy smokes, I didn't think it would be that big.
Yeah. Going to 2-inch accessories from 1 1/4 is like a whole different ball game. It's just like, it feels like things are 3 or 4 times the size.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think probably the big separator in terms of quality. So like 1 1/4 and 2-inch are just sizes. Now the next thing I think maybe to mention is there's going to be some cheaper entry level ones that I don't know. They'll probably show more scatter and maybe not allow you to achieve as tight of a focus. And probably the big separator between some of those entry level ones and the next step up would be look for ones that have the dielectric coatings applied to them. Usually that's an indicator that you're going to get a diagonal that is pretty darn good and will make you pretty happy. And like basically all of the telescope makers, Orion, Explore Scientific, on and on and on, provide diagonals with the dielectric coatings. And the dielectric coatings just allow for better light transmission. And they make the mirror tougher so that you can clean it without scratching it easily. However, just like all other optics, my recommendation, and I think you're probably of the same mind, Chris, is that you probably don't want to touch your optics all that often, if at all. Like you'll likely do more damage to your optics than what small, almost impossible to detect impact a little bit of dust would have on your view.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true, Shane. Now, like, things have improved over time. Like, I know when I recently bought a little telescope, it came with a 1.25 inch diagonal, and it was decent. Like, I was surprised how decent it was. So, like, as far as a beginner went, like with my nephew who I was piecing it together for, like, I sent that with it and I thought it was perfectly good. And with the other telescope I bought, it had come with a 1.25 inch prism, and that thing, not good, to say the least. So maybe with that, I'll let you kind of explain the difference between prisms and mirrors.
Yeah. So that's a great distinction. So most diagonals that you'll see available are mirrors. And it's just a mirror at a 45-degree angle, like Chris said, in the housing, and it bounces the light up to your eye. Whereas a prism is a whole different animal. And um, the older telescopes that I've talked about, like from the 1960s, they all came with prisms basically. And some of the newer telescopes that are, very entry level may come with a prism as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there, I think probably more so than mirror diagonals, there's a huge gap with prisms of lower quality and decent to high quality.
Yeah.
Like you can get probably a fairly cheap mirror diagonal and it's going to perform okay. Like you're probably
Yep.
not going to have a bad experience. But if you have a cheap prism, it may be to the point where you think your whole setup is garbage because you can't
Yep.
get a good focus.
Yeah.
Now, with that being said, don't disparage all prisms. Prisms of good quality are phenomenal. And they are typically preferred at focal lengths over like f7. So if you have f7 or slower, the prism typically will show less scatter from stars and probably provide you, a more contrasty, sharper view. There, we've talked about Bill Paoloni quite a bit from Cloudy Nights, and I think he's conducted one of the best comparisons between various mirror diagonals and various prism diagonals. And he wrote up this wonderful article about his approach of how he evaluated them all and then the results. And his results were that, prisms exceed the performance of mirrored diagonals in slower telescopes. Now, if you're below f7, so, faster telescopes, f5, f6, a mirror was preferred. But I mentioned that just to say that, again, prisms should not be ignored. And, an interesting thing that I think Bill reported in that test was that the prisms actually cooled a little bit faster. So
Really?
yeah. So we've talked about you have to acclimate your telescope to the outside temperature. Well, that also includes your diagonal. There's, that mirror or that prism needs to be at the same temperature as the outside in order to perform well.
Huh.
And he reported that the prisms cool a little quicker. Now, who knows if that's because of the prism or just the design of that particular diagonal? Maybe there was other factors that contributed to that. But
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah, it is interesting.
So yeah, the prism that I received, it was a 90-degree with an 80 millimeter f5, and it was so poor. It was really unfortunate that they even put that in, because the other 80 millimeter f5 I bought came with the absolute cheapest mirror, and it was perfectly good. Like it was totally fine. And it was just really unfortunate. And I think the prism even was correct image. It was 90-degree, but correct image. I still have it. I may still have it somewhere. I may have just thrown it in the trash, but it was so poor that like my wife came out and looked through it and she's like, "What's wrong with this telescope?" Like it was like on a bright star. There was big streaks through the field of view on the moon.
Yeah.
Like it was wild, right? It was so bad. And then like the other thing I found anyway is that like through a main telescope, like through a finder, I could kind of see having a correct image when you're going back and forth for the charts. But I'm just so used now to having that mirror reversed image that holy cow, like I was disoriented, to say the best. Like when I put it in, I can't remember if I even bothered looking in it before I just threw it in the telescope. I just thought, oh, it's kind of a funny looking cell or whatever. I don't think I ever looked in it. And then when I went outside, I'm like, what is going on with this? It was just shocking because things were correctly oriented, but very distorted.
Yeah. I've read, and again, I don't have any experience with these, but William Optics and Bader make 45-degree angle prisms that are correct image. And I've heard that they're okay. If you want to use them for astronomy, you can, and they're not too bad.
Yeah.
But those are the only two that I've heard are passable. When you get into those correct image ones, they just seem like the quality's not there.
Yeah.
Word of caution, not saying that that'll be that's going to be everybody's experience, but that's what I've read. And in some cases, like with some of the cheaper correct image ones, I've experienced as well.
Yeah. So one other thing I want to add, and I'm not sure how much more you want to chat about star diagonals. But when I was looking for the widest true field, so I had was buying the Borg Pentax 5-inch apochromat, which has a 750 millimeter focal length. It's f6, and my wife for a wedding gift had bought me the Pentax 40 XW, which should max out a 2-inch focuser. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But this is a lot of glass, and this is a pretty expensive. This is like sort of my ultimate portable telescope, which I haven't used as much recently, but that was my main telescope for like 10 years, and that was my plan. And I wanted to observe all this stuff with it, which I did. But I wanted to make sure that I wasn't vignetting. And so what vignetting is if in this case anyway, if the light cone entering that diagonal is impeded by the diagonal, and the eyepiece can take that larger light cone, then you'll see this image degradation or light drop off as you get towards the edge of that field. And after I placed the order for the telescope, and my wife had bought me the eyepiece, and it was sort of sitting on my shelf, I was doing some reading, like what diagonal to get, and I quickly came to understand that there's actually very few diagonals where you can max that out. Now, a lot of people who observe don't worry about it. They're like, well, I only use it as a finder, or I only use it as, whatever. I'm not going to use the widest field. But I'm like, man, I already own the widest field eyepiece. I have this super wide field apochromatic telescope coming that's really designed for wide field. It's an astrograph, but I'm going to use it visually mostly for wide field. And this is why I'm buying it. I don't want to run into this. So I did a pile of research, and it turned out that there's only a handful of ones that won't impede on that light cone, or if they do, it's pretty minimal. There was the Lumicon, Astrophysics, and I think the Teleview, maybe the newer Beta one as well, the BBHS or something like that. I think it also doesn't impede, or doesn't impede very much. And I ended up going with the Lumicon, and they weren't, honestly, like those diagonals, although they're high-end diagonals, they're certainly sort of competitively priced amongst each other. But I went with the Lumicon, and the Lumicon is a strange looking diagonal because it's sliced off, whereas the typical 90-degree diagonals have like a box on the bottom. It actually is flat across the mirror, so you actually see that 45-degree angle. So this is a diagonal that almost looks like a 45-degree diagonal, but then right at the top, the light cone exits at 90 degrees. So it's kind of, a lot of people don't like the look. I like the look. I think it looks different, and I kind of like it. It also shaves off incredible weight. So when I go and travel, my Lumicon diagonal only weighs about the same as an average 1.25 inch diagonal. So I also really like that as well. And then back when I bought this, Lumicon was the one that was sourcing the mirrors for Teleview and Astrophysics. So I also like the fact that they were like the original source, and you can actually buy different quality levels from Lumicon when you can get them. Soon as you can't get them, and so recently this past year I bought two more. I bought a 95% and a 98 or 99%, and certainly they're really nice diagonals. And I didn't get any of this vignetting, any image drop off in the 3.6 or 3.7 degree true field I was getting with that 5-inch. So kind of wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, cool. Maybe just a few more points about diagonals. I prefer diagonals that have a compression ring rather than a set screw. So a set screw applies tension by just a screw kind of drilling into your eyepiece. And over time, it'll leave little marks on your eyepiece barrel. It doesn't impact the eyepiece performance, but it just makes it kind of marred up and maybe not quite as pretty. Whereas a compression ring, you avoid all of that. So that's quite handy. It maintains kind of the value of your eyepiece because there's no damage being done to it. And then the other thing is some diagonals, like the barrel or the eyepiece holder, can detach and unscrew. Not all of them. Like Teleview is just one block of aluminum, and you can't remove any of that stuff. So there's pros and cons to that. The advantage of being able to remove those is if you do get some dust in your mirror or your prism, it's a little bit nicer to be able to remove the nose piece and the eyepiece holder to use like your little dust blower thing to remove the dust. It just cleans it a little bit easier. And then the other thing, and I guess maybe an advantage of like the fixed Teleview style diagonal where you can't remove that stuff, is it just that stuff can't become loose on you and rotate when you don't want it to.
Mm-hmm.
But one more advantage about the removable stuff, if you go with like the Bader style, all of their threadings are T2. So it's a very like common standard. And what that allows you to do is like, it's very modular. You can get a Bader diagonal and unscrew some of that stuff and add different accessories onto it. For example, like if you're going to do some bino viewing, you want the shortest light path possible. So you can, if you have the Bader stuff, you can shorten the light path by removing the eyepiece holder and putting in a small adapter, which really shrinks things up.
Yeah.
Quite handy. And like another accessory that Bader has for their 1.25" diagonals is a little helical focuser, which is the eyepiece holder. So like my Takahashi 76, when I first got it, it just had a single speed focuser on it. But using the Bader diagonal that I have with the helical focuser for the eyepiece holder, that became my fine focus, and it works phenomenally well. So there's kind of, I guess some different options out there that certainly aren't needed, but just, be aware that they're there because you may find value in them. And, I certainly did. I'm a big fan of the Bader stuff because of the adaptability and, the choices that you have to, again, remove barrels, add barrels. Like that 1.25" Bader prism that I have, I can remove the 1.25" barrel that goes into the telescope and put a 2" on there, so it would fit a 2" telescope. And I just think that that's cool. You can basically do whatever you want with it.
Cool. Well, I guess sort of on my last point on this, and that is that I only really ever have had one diagonal for most of my observing in the past 15 or 16 years. I just used that one Lumicon diagonal. And Shane, earlier you mentioned the fact that in less expensive diagonals, they can kind of wear out or whatever. And honestly, inexpensive diagonals might run $50 for a 1.25, maybe even less, and then maybe $100 or so for a 2". And I see, like when I look online, I see a lot of people buying diagonals quite frequently. And $100 here and $100 there on 2" diagonals seems like an awful lot of money to me. So, that this past year I bought a couple spares from Lumicon in a sale, and I think I paid like a couple $100 for each. And now I kind of have them sitting in plastic wrap on my shelf, and I have to transition out from my old 15 or 16-year-old one to one of these new ones here. I have to get it modified sometime the next year or so, but I didn't want to pass up on the price. But I definitely recommend getting a really good diagonal. Get a really good Teleview, astrophysics, like maybe one of the Baders. A lot of different options with the Baders can be a bit confusing. Or like if you can source a Lumicon, I really like them. Some people don't. It's sort of the Lumicons, you either love them or you dislike them a great deal. I'm in the love it camp. Does not have the compression ring that you like. It has nylon screws instead. It's pretty utilitarian. I like that. It's super, super light. So I never think anything of it when I'm taking it with me. It takes up less room in my bag. it's no heavier than a 1 1/4 or like a heavier 1 1/4. So I never think about taking a 1 1/4 with me. And when I travel, I just take a really light 2-inch eyepiece. So I just love having those wide field of views. So anyway, that's kind of like my parting note is that I think if people are into astronomy and they're to the point, maybe they've had one, I have one 2-inch diagonal. And then I realized that definitely 2-inch eyepieces were for me, and I was going to be buying more of them. So I just invested right off the hop. Basically, spent the extra $100 and got a really good diagonal, and then that's kind of lived with me for really the life of a diagonal is probably 12 to 15 years. And I'm just outside of that now, so it's time to get another. But I was reading posts last night, and there was one person, I think they said they had 10 inexpensive diagonals. I'm like, that's like $1,000 in diagonals minimum, right? So I thought I would kind of make this point. Certainly if you're a collector of every cheap diagonal that comes out, I guess that's one thing, but I would say just get a good one, settle in, like any of these ones that we've mentioned here. They're not really that expensive if this is what you're going to be doing, and it's less expensive if you're going to be going out and buying new diagonals all the time, because you're seeking some sort of magical diagonal experience that actually doesn't really exist, apart from the 4 that we recommend.
Yeah, great point. And telescopes will change probably in many observers' lifetime. Like you'll purchase some, you'll sell some, you'll use a certain telescope for a period of time, and then maybe use a different one for another period of time. But what remains constant are the eyepieces and the diagonal, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that's an area where I don't mind spending some money, because it's sort of a buy or cry once and then love it for the rest of your life, because you're going to use those components on all of your telescopes during all of your observing. So great advice, I think, Chris, to say, get a good diagonal, because you'll use it forever, and it'll be something that you don't have to question. It just performs well.
Yeah, and I do kind of think that goes for a lot of different things. Like, I think it's good to put in the time looking at things like, again, like my 60 millimeter Takahashi is a good example. It's not an inexpensive telescope. It's not the most expensive 60 millimeter you can get by any measure either. But for me, it's sort of like the best one. And and that telescope has traveled with me all over the place now. And I have a handful of 2-inch eyepieces, sort of a home and away team, and the lighter ones go with me when I fly, and the other ones are for when I'm around here. And it's a pretty set. Like, I'm not buying and going through a lot of eyepieces. Now there is a lot of fun to buying new stuff, and I do like to get stuff from time to time. I've been buying more now during the pandemic. I probably bought more during the pandemic than in the past 16 years, which was really when I bought my last kind of set of gear. But I'm working on different projects now, and it's time to maybe upgrade some of the stuff. But again, like I think that sometimes people should just stop and hold and learn the night sky, and then really enjoy the experience. And then if you want to play around with some things, that's cool, but not to get too focused on buying like a large quantity of things.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. So let's talk about, Larry sent us an email. He sent us an email that he labeled that this would be good for the mailbag. But I actually thought that this was among the best emails that we received. We do really appreciate hearing from listeners. And once in a while, somebody will send us something that we think is so good. It really wouldn't be it wouldn't give this question justice just to give it 5 minutes in an episode. So we're going to give it the rest of this episode here. And Shane, do you want to read? I've kind of paraphrased it a bit in 3 extremely short paragraphs. Do you just want to read what Larry wrote us?
Oh yeah. I'll need a minute to pull that up.
Oh well, I can read it. That's fine. That's
okay.
fine. We do this very informal. We don't really script these things out that much. I did put it in the show notes.
Oh yeah, here we go.
There you go. Yeah, go ahead, because you were talking to him, and I didn't want to kind of steal your voice from this.
Yeah. And maybe just before I get into it, one of the things that like you said, this is a really good email that we really appreciated is I think sometimes you and I get going and we talk, and sometimes we skip a step in terms of assumed knowledge or well, really that's it, assumed knowledge. And I think what Larry wrote here is one of the times we've overlooked maybe not talking about an important topic because you and I have just done this for a long time, and sometimes we miss some things like this. But
yeah,
Larry wrote, I mentioned before that I was thinking about picking up an older 60 millimeter telescope. Well, the more I thought about that, the more I've been thinking that I don't really need another long focal length refractor. What I could justify buying is a shorter focal length wide field refractor. All of Chris's talk about the joys of an ST80 have had an impact, I guess. I've had a question that has confused me. What is the advantage of a 2-inch focuser / diagonal in terms of increased field of view? And you and I, this is the part that you and I think have overlooked a little bit. We talk a lot about 1.25 inch and 2-inch, but I don't think we've really spent time to talk about what that means in terms of performance and experience at the eyepiece.
Yeah, and so earlier on in this episode, we talked about the 1.25 and the 2-inch diagonals. So I think people have come to understand that the 1.25 inch, they're for your 1.25 inch eyepieces, of which that's probably going to be more of your eyepieces, though it may not be. And then we all have a bit of a selection of 2-inch eyepieces. I have a 40, a 30, 12 and a half. I think I have another one in there. And then I have like lots of 1.25, like a 20, a 14, a 10, and 7 and 5 and a 3.5 and 5 and 3 point, all kinds of ones. But you can use the 1.25 in the 2-inch. The advantage of the 2 inches that it gives you sort of that ultimate wide field of view as well. You're able to accommodate a variety of different sizes. Really is what it comes down to. But Shane, I think where we should lead off from here is maybe another set of definitions I'm going to hit you up with. Hope you don't mind me doing. I kind of spring these on you, and then I think we have a bit of a discussion. So what's a TFOV and what is AFOV, and what is the difference between these two acronyms?
So TFOV is true field of view, and then the A is apparent, so apparent field of view. So the eyepieces are advertised with apparent field of view. So the Teleview Panoptix are advertised as 68 degrees apparent field of view. But the one we really care about is the true field of view, which is how much of the sky is visible through that eyepiece with that particular telescope. So, my 68 degree 24 millimeter Panoptic will give me, it depends on the telescope, but like in the little mini Borg that we've talked about a lot, it'll give me a 9 degree true field of view. So I'll get to see 9 degrees of the sky through that eyepiece with that telescope. If I'm using it on my Takahashi 76, I think, I haven't done the calculation, but I think the field of view is just under, the true field of view is just under 3 degrees of the sky that I can see with that same eyepiece, just different telescope.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you're totally right here. The apparent field of view is how eyepieces are advertised. So it kind of gives you an indication, and it gives you some numbers to kind of very loosely work with. And then the true field is what that eyepiece actually provides through any given instrument, right? So the apparent field is just kind of what you get at zero power if you're just kind of to hold it up and look at your wall or floor or something like that. I don't know why you would do that. And then the true field is going to be when you factor in that into the optical chain, like whatever telescope you're doing. But so there's some hard numbers though, because regardless of those apparent fields, and those apparent fields can vary a little bit. There's different ways of calculating those. But to actually find out what those true fields are, you kind of ignore that apparent field. it turns out. And what you're looking for is you're looking for what's called the field stop diameter. So the size of the, I think it's the bottom lens in the eyepiece. So for our 1.25 inch eyepiece, and we talked about a few in the past episode, you've talked about your Panoptic 24 a lot. What you're looking at is somewhere between 27 millimeters and 30 millimeters will be your rough maximum field stops for the 1.25. And there actually isn't a huge difference between, I think Shane, your Panoptic has like a 27 point something, and I think there's another one that's 28, and things like that. There's not huge differences in the actual field that you'll get, but those provide the widest field of views. And I think it's a pretty small number. I think there's the Panoptic 24, which is 68 degrees. There's the APM 24, which comes out to 65 degrees. And then I think there's an Explorer Scientific 24, which is also labeled as 68. And there used to be a Mead that was 24 and 68. And I think there either is a new Mead and maybe a Celestron. And those are actually based on the APM model. I think APM is actually licensed to those companies or something like that to produce those. But in general, they all give about the widest field of view you can get with a 1.25. Now, what makes it a little bit confusing is that as people are getting into astronomy, they'll start to read that well, the higher sort of the number on your eyepiece in millimeters, the lower power you're going to get. So they might look at something like I don't know, like a 37 or a 38 millimeter eyepiece, but that eyepiece might be like an orthoscopic or something that only has like a 35 or 40 degree field of view or something. I've seen some of them are pretty small, and they may have that maximum field stop, but they may not. And in fact, really, those ones that we mentioned, the Panoptic and the APM, those are probably the height of optical quality for your maximum field stop, even though they don't have that longer or higher number to give you the lower power. So it's a little bit of a strange situation where sometimes the lower power eyepieces won't necessarily, for a variety of reasons, have the widest field of view. And I think that's an important distinction to make with all eyepieces, something people might not realize.
Yeah, that is a good point. Like my 40 millimeter Kellner provides about the same field of view as the 24 millimeter Panoptic. So longer focal length eyepiece doesn't necessarily mean wider field of view. It really comes down to that field stop.
Yeah, and that's kind of a special eyepiece, sort of standalone. But yeah, if people are looking to max it out, that they need to kind of understand that it's all in the field stop, and you need to look at 27 to 30 millimeter field stops, regardless of whether it's going to give you higher or lower power or whatever. But to each their own. I mean, there can be reasons to go with like a 40 millimeter. You might have like an f10 scope. Think about like that nice little Borg 50 millimeter f10 that's been kicking around for a while on some of the used sites, and having a 40 millimeter Kellner like you have, Shane, would be really amazing to have in that, right? So but on the flip side, if you were going to get like a 50 millimeter f5 or something, then like you said, your Panoptic is probably going to be a more enjoyable and more usable experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe another point about field stop is it's actually hard information to find. A lot of the eyepiece manufacturers don't really advertise it. Typically, you have to rely on other amateurs measuring the field stop. Teleview is one of the few that does publish it. So, you still use the apparent field of view as a bit of a gauge to tell you, how wide that particular eyepiece will be compared to others with a similar barrel size. But field stop is the actual way of calculating it.
Yeah, I was looking at this last night. I mean, this is something that I think an awful lot about, even though we haven't talked about it too much, is the business of the field stop. So companies that publish these include Teleview, Bader, Masayama, And I don't know if Pentax does publish theirs or not, but if you do want to find them out, the best thing to do is just take your eyepiece and then say it's a Pentax 40 millimeter XW, just type that in and then type field stop diameter, and then you'll be taken to a nice Cloudy Nights link, because typically that's information somebody's gathered up on Cloudy Nights, and you're able to take advantage of that. Like we've mentioned Bill before, he's pretty good at measuring those and publishing them on there. So
Can I just
go ahead.
Sorry, Chris, I just want to interrupt you on that. And there's an awesome sticky post on Cloudy Nights. Go to the Eyepiece forum. Perfect. And it's there's Eyepiece buying guide, and it's updated annually. It's a giant spreadsheet with just about every known eyepiece in there, and it's a collection of all of these measurements. So, like it'll list the manufacturer, the focal length, the apparent field of view, and if known, the field stop. And I think there's probably a few other things in there. So, if you're considering a new eyepiece purchase, that document is awesome, because it's a spreadsheet. You can sort it. You can do all sorts of ways to manipulate the data so that you can see, say all 1.25" eyepieces that have a field stop greater than 25 millimeters or something like that. And it's a real handy resource. So Cloudy Nights, and it's the Eyepiece buying guide.
Yeah, that's an awesome recommendation. I think there's a few people that contribute to that. There's quite a few people that contribute to that. One of them is, I think, Don Pensack. I'm probably getting his name wrong, but he runs a company. I haven't used them before, but they're very reputable, called Eyepieces, etc., etc., and or eyepieces.com or something like that. Anyway, people can look them up. I think he's out of California or something. Competitively priced and excellent eyepieces, and that's his business as far as I know. And he's a frequent poster on the forums. People buy from him, and they ask questions. He's like live and in person kind of thing on there, like 24/7 it seems, and seems like an excellent reputable source for this information. I think he kind of helps cobble that together, and he has some opinions, but to be honest, for somebody who's actually selling this stuff, he's more informative than trying to just trying to make sales or anything like that. So it's pretty good. So I'm going to get into something here, Shane. Now I put our notes in here from the emails we had used when we were replying back to Larry. I didn't know if you wanted to read your email, or you just want to use it as notes for this, or what.
Yeah, I can read my response.
Sure.
So I just said, good question. So the simple answer is 2-inch eyepieces have the ability to provide wider field of view than 1.25" due to having the potential for a much larger field stop. So with my 76 millimeter telescope, which is 570 millimeter focal length, the widest field I can get with 1.25" is 2.86 degrees. The widest field with a 2-inch is 4.89 degrees, so a full 2 degrees more. The 24 millimeter Panoptic and the 41 millimeter Panoptic provide the largest field of views in their respective barrel diameters. Now, there's others, right? Those are just TeleVue. Those are the ones I own. But like you mentioned, like the Pentax 40 is the same thing, right? It has the largest field stop possible in a 2-inch. And I know there's other manufacturers that compete in those areas. And then I just said, this website is a fun resource for figuring out your field. I should have probably said your field of view based on eyepiece and telescope combinations. And we'll put this in the show notes, but it's astronomy.tools/calculators/field_of_view. Basically, if you go to Google and you just type in telescope field of view, FOV, telescope FOV calculator, search, I think it's the first hit. And it's awesome. Like you have to pick an object. So I just pick M1 all of the time from the drop down, but then you fill out the rest of the details, your telescope aperture, focal length. Then it has a whole bunch of eyepieces loaded into its database. So you can pick those from a drop down menu. But if it doesn't have the eyepiece you're considering, you can, again, just plug in the focal length and the apparent field of view. And then it tells you, like, it calculates what your true field of view will be and a bunch of other little stats. So it's a handy little resource. But Chris, you
Yeah,
also had some. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, because I work in research and I can't have somebody else do my maths for me. So I have to do my own. So I totally agree with everything you're saying. I think it's a great recommendation. So the one thing with the Teleview eyepieces is, and this is kind of what they're renowned for, is they really give like the maximum sharp field of view. So even though you can probably squeeze a few more millimeters out of a 1.25 barrel, what they do is when they give you a 24 millimeter, it's pretty much sharp to the edge. And this is not a controversial thing to say at all. It's the Pentax or the Panoptix by Teleview are just excellent. Now, when you go to like a Pentax or another provider, sometimes you might get like a little bit of like optical fall off at the very edge. So I think like with the 41 Panoptic, the field stop in that is 46.5, because what Teleview found is that in the majority of telescopes, that's where it would be sharp too. But like my Pentax has another 0.5 millimeter on the edge. But definitely, I mean, you can see the difference between the Pentax and the Panoptic. And the difference, and this is pretty hair splitting differences. So you're gaining arc minutes in field of view, sometimes arc seconds between eyepieces. And why might you choose one over the other is coming down to personal preference. The other is how much you're going to use nebula filters. So I use nebula filters quite a bit, and you actually notice those fall offs quite a bit less when you're using the nebula filters. But mostly it's just personal preference, or and one of the things can be cost. The Teleview, some of them can be pretty expensive. So anyway, so I'm going to get into the maths here a little bit. So I'm just going to give it like this. So all the website the chain has provided is doing, and certainly people can use that, and that is a super handy resource. But if you kind of want to run the numbers yourself, all you need to do, regardless of the eyepiece, anything else that we've said, you just need to take the field stop diameter, divide it by the focal length of the telescope, and multiply it by radian, which is 57.3. And that will actually give you the exact, or it should give you the exact true field of an eyepiece. Now, if any of the numbers are wrong or something, then all bets are off. But you've actually got total control over it. So with my 47 millimeter field stop in my Pentax XW, when I was trying to figure out the actual true field of view that it's going to give me in my 5-inch Apochromat, which has a 750 millimeter focal length, I just take the 47 field stop divided by 750 and then multiply it by 57.3, and that gives a 3.6 degree true field of view, regardless of what Pentax says the apparent field of view, and regardless of any other numbers that might be floating around out there. I think if you actually, a lot of what people will do is they'll take the magnification and they'll divide that apparent field by the magnification, which is very rough, and it always gives a slightly larger number. So I think if you divide like 70 degrees apparent field by the 18.6 I get there, you get like a 3 3/4, so like 3.75, which you can see that difference. And that's something I found kind of annoying. I was making my little circles for finders, and I was finding that I was overestimating my field of views. And so I was like, I need to actually get that formula in my head. So it's something I'm running all the time. Now, if I had only a 1.25 inch focuser on that telescope, and I wanted to know, and I had Shane's 24, or also the Teleview 32 millimeter Plossl, which I had for a while before I crushed it in a vise. Those both have about a 27 millimeter field stop. So you take the 27, you divide it by the 750, you multiply it by the 57.3, and that gives you pretty much exactly 2 degree field of view. So right there, this gives you the difference between, at least in that telescope, between sort of the maximum field of view you can get with a 2-inch eyepiece being 3.6 degrees, And the maximum field of view you can get with a 32 or any eyepiece that gives you the maximum in a 1.2 inch format, and that ends up being 2 degrees. And that is a significant field of view difference, the difference between a 2 degree field, true field, and a 3.6 degree true field. So in terms of the moon being about half a degree across, in the 1 1/4, you're only going to be able to fit 4 moons, where in the 2 inch format, you're going to be able to fit more than 7 moons across. So that kind of gives you what we're looking at. It's a pretty noticeable difference in field. That said, in the last episode, Shane talked about 0.96 SMC orthos for doing deep sky. If you're looking at galaxies or planetary nebulae, things that are really small, sort of all bets are off. This really doesn't apply to that. So you need to be able to match what you're observing to these type of formulas. And honestly, that's like a lot of the fun for me, is figuring out what eyepieces and optics are going to work best for seeing what objects, eh?
Yeah, for sure. And hopefully we didn't cause more confusion than maybe what already existed.
Uh-oh.
But no, I not a criticism at all. It's just that these are some numbers and concepts to be aware of. And the field of view thing is a little bit of a mystery, I think. I know it was for me, certainly. When I was getting into the hobby, it was kind of hard to decipher, what some of these numbers meant, and more so what it would mean for my viewing.
Yeah.
And I still remember, like, I started, like probably many have started, with the Plossels that came with my telescope, and used those for an extensive amount of time. And my first eyepiece purchase outside of some Plossels was what the heck was it? An 84 millimeter Spears Waller, 10 millimeter, I think it was. And
okay. Like an 84 degree. Yeah.
I could not believe the difference that a wide field eyepiece made. Like, I was just blown away by everything that I could see, and really changed my I guess views, pun intended, I guess, on what eyepieces I preferred, and what advantages you gain by some of these wider fields.
So I had come into astronomy, I think just like really just a few years before you. I think like maybe like 3 or 4 years or something like that. And I learned a valuable lesson. I had also purchased some of the Spears Whalers, which are basically, like you said, like 80 odd degree fields of view, and much less expensive than anything else that was available, especially here in Canada. We have to go over the border and pay duty and exchange and all kinds of other things. So what I wanted to say was that because I came a few years earlier, the Spears Whalers were available in 70 degree odd eyepieces. And so I had purchased a whole pile of those and used. And then like around the time when you came along, they were selling the 80 degree fields. And so I jumped on those. So I sold off my 70s and I replaced them with the 80s. And I was really disappointed because I found out a couple things. One is that in those focal lengths, to me anyway, it didn't really matter whether it was 70 or 80 degrees in those ones. Because I think I had the 10 and 14, and maybe there was a 7 or something like that. I think those are the ones I had. But the 70 degree ones had better eye relief, so I could use them with my glasses much easier. And the 80s did not. I didn't know the business of eye relief at the time. I just knew that wider was better, and so I should go with the wider ones. And I was a little bit disappointed. They were still good, and I didn't like switch back or anything. But I do just mention that as well. So sometimes the wide field isn't necessarily the be all to end all. There's a lot of other factors in play here when it comes to eyepieces. But when you are trying to get the maximum field of view, I think what we say here is probably the best guidance.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Well, Shane, by the rapid succession of text messages I'm getting from you, it seems like we might be close to the end of our time.
Well, in an effort to avoid headaches on the back end, yep, we probably should wrap it up.
Okay. Well, I think there's a couple minutes. If you have anything left to add, certainly you know quite a bit about this stuff. So I'll give you the last word.
No, Chris, we covered everything. Maybe the last word is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And as always, my recommendation is just to try different things to see what you like, because wider is not always better. Orthos are not always better. It really depends on what you like to do and how you like to observe. So if possible, try different gear and see what you like.
Wow, that was very beautiful and eloquent. I have a tear in my eye. All right, thanks so much, Shane.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. If you are interested in more information, would like to contact us, or if you would like to support the podcast, check out our website, actualastronomy.com.